Last summer, I harvested just over 40 kilos of ripe tomatoes from only 4 plants, all grown in the same raised garden bed I had used the previous year with the exact same varieties. In the same spot and under the same sun, I hadn't even reached 14 kilos before. The soil was the same and the seeds were too. The only thing I changed was my way of watering, and this simple adjustment transformed a season of split tomatoes, fruits blackened at the base, and exhausted plants into the best harvest I have ever obtained. And here is what might surprise you. The watering error that silently destroys your tomatoes isn't necessarily a lack of water. It's not the classic excess of water either. The real problem is more specific. Many gardeners water every day, but only a little bit. They believe they are being consistent. In reality, they make the plant dependent on surface moisture, weaken its roots, and set the stage for almost every known trouble. Skin that bursts, leaves that yellow, growth that stalls, and that black spot at the end of the fruit called blossom end rot. In this video, I'm going to show you how I water my tomatoes today. At what time, at what frequency, with what quantity of water, and especially to what depth. You will understand why watering less often, more slowly, and more deeply can make an ordinary plant much more productive. Stay until the end, as I will also share an almost free buried bottle trick that sends water to the deep roots in open ground as well as in large pots. But before the method, I must tell you how I discovered it. I didn't learn it in a manual. I learned it by making mistakes for nearly 15 years. For a long time, every evening after dinner, I would go out with the hose. I gave each plant a good dose of water at the base and then went back inside convinced I had done well. The leaves were green. The top of the soil looked wet. I thought I was a careful gardener. Yet every year around mid-July, the same scenario returned. My Roma tomatoes had black bottoms. My large tomatoes would split just as they were ripening. The bottom leaves turned yellow and moved up the stems. The plants bloomed heavily in June, then ran out of steam in August. I blamed the weather, the varieties, and the soil. I bought calcium and spray treatments. Nothing really fixed the problem. Then a few summers ago, I came across agronomic resources from the University of California that explained the depth of tomato roots and the role of moisture in transporting calcium to the fruits. This completely changed my way of looking at watering. So if you water your tomatoes like I used to, listen closely. You are not failing. You are simply doing what almost everyone does because no one ever explained the invisible part of the plant. This invisible part is the roots. A mature tomato plant can send its roots 60 to 90 centimeters deep into the soil. It is not a small indoor plant. It is a fruiting plant capable of seeking water deep down and air to the dry regions of South America. But when you pour a little water on the surface every evening, you train the roots to stay in the first few centimeters where moisture returns without effort. Shallow roots regulate water poorly. They dry out quickly as soon as the sun heats up. They absorb dissolved minerals less regularly. The plant then goes from being soaked at 6 p.m. to almost dry by the following noon. This wet, dry yo-yo effect is the real danger. Blossom end rot is not always a lack of calcium in the soil. Often, the calcium is there, but it doesn't reach the fruit correctly because the moisture varies too much. Split tomatoes follow the same logic. The fruit slows down during a dry period and then suddenly receives a lot of water. Its flesh swells faster than its skin can stretch and it bursts. After 3 seasons of testing this approach, my conclusion is simple. The solution is not to give more water. It is to give the right water in the right place, at the right depth, and with the right rhythm. Once this is understood, everything becomes logical. Now let's see how to do it. Before even touching the garden hose, there is an essential habit to change. Stop guessing. The soil surface can lie to you. The first centimeter dries very quickly under the sun or wind, while the earth located further down may still contain all the moisture the tomato needs. The right reflex is the finger test, but done correctly. Stick your index finger into the ground about 5 centimeters away from the main stem, not directly against the collar. Go as deep as possible, ideally to the second knuckle, which is about 8 to 10 centimeters. If the earth is cool and slightly damp, like a well-wrung sponge, do not water. The plant still has water available. If it is dry, crumbly, and almost dusty throughout the depth of your finger, then it is time to water. And if it is heavy, sticky, and waterlogged to the point where you could almost squeeze water out of it, you have already watered too much. In that case, let the soil breathe for a day or two. If your tomatoes are growing in pots, tubs, or a small raised planter, you can also learn to read the weight of the container. A well-hydrated pot feels heavy. A dry pot becomes surprisingly light. After a few days of practice, this difference becomes obvious. Classic advice often says to water on a certain day at a certain frequency, but a tomato does not follow a calendar. It responds to the weather, the heat, the wind, the size of its roots, and the actual moisture of the soil. Your schedule should therefore serve as a reminder to check, not an automatic order to water. The rule is simple. We don't water because it's Tuesday. We water because the soil deep down demands it. Now that you know when to water, let's see how to provide the water correctly. This is precisely where most gardeners make the mistake that costs them the most in their harvest. Stop the small, quick waterings and start watering abundantly, but less often. In the middle of summer, for a mature tomato plant, I generally give between 4 and 8 L of water per plant, slowly directly at the base every 3 to 5 days. Not a little shower every evening, but a real deep soak twice a week, sometimes 3 if the heat becomes intense. Why does this change everything? Because a slow and generous watering has time to sink into the soil, often down to 30 or 45 centimeters. The deep roots finally receive the water they are looking for. Then when the surface dries a day or two later, the roots are encouraged to go even deeper. You no longer make the plant fragile in the face of drought. You train it to become more resistant. My method is very simple. I remove the nozzle from the hose, I set the water to a small trickle, and then place the hose at the base of the plant. I let it run for about 2 to 3 minutes per tomato, depending on the pressure and the texture of the soil. If you use a soaker hose or a drip system, that's even better. The essential thing is that the water goes into the ground, not on the foliage. Wet leaves promote fungal diseases, especially in summer. Early blight, septoria, brown spots, and rapid weakening of the plant. A tomato doesn't need its leaves washed. It needs its roots hydrated. So water the soil, not the plant. And if possible, do it in the morning, ideally between 6 and 9 a.m. The soil absorbs better before the high heat, splashes dry quickly, and the plant enters the day already well hydrated. Very well, let's continue. Because now that you are watering deeply, and only when the soil demands it, the next step can literally lock the moisture around the roots. Mulching. And when I say mulch, I'm not talking about a thin handful of straw thrown on to look pretty. I'm talking about a real protective layer. This is one of the most profitable actions I take every spring, and it is often what makes the difference between watering twice a week and having to come back with the hose almost every day. When your tomato plants reach about 30 centimeters and the soil is already well warmed, spread 5 to 8 centimeters of organic mulch over the entire root zone. You can use straw, shredded dead leaves, or grass clippings that have dried for a few days. Just keep a space of about 5 inches around the main stem to avoid trapping moisture against the collar and promoting rot. The result is impressive. The mulch limits evaporation, protects soil life, reduces competing weeds, and keeps the roots much cooler during scorching days. In hot regions where soil temperature can climb very fast, this layer acts like an insulating blanket, but in a good way. It prevents excessive heat from attacking the roots. I have grown mulched and unmulched tomatoes side by side. The mulched plants required significantly less water, stayed more consistent, and bore more fruit. If you garden in a cool climate, don't rush. Wait until the earth reaches about 15 to 16 degrees before mulching. Otherwise, you risk keeping the soil cold for too long. In a warm climate, on the contrary, the sooner you mulch after the plant has established, the better. Once your watering rhythm is in place and the mulch is protecting the soil, you still need to learn to adapt the method throughout the season. Because a tomato does not have the same needs at the beginning of June as it does at the end of July. During the first 3 or 4 weeks after transplantation, the root system is still limited. The plant cannot yet draw water very deeply at this stage. I therefore water a little more often, but still deeply, about every 2 or 3 days, with roughly 2 L of water per plant. Then, as the tomato grows, its stems thicken and its roots lengthen, I gradually space out the waterings. In the middle of summer, when an adult plant is already bearing fruit, I generally return to a cycle of 3 to 5 days with 4 to 8 L per plant, depending on the heat, the wind, and the type of soil. If temperatures exceed 33 degrees or C for several days in a row, it may be necessary to water every 2 days. But be careful. This does not mean going back to small daily sips. Even in hot periods, it is better to keep a deep and stable watering. And if a heavy rain falls, do not keep your scheduled watering out of reflex. Skip it, wait, and then check the earth with the finger test. Many tomatoes suffer more from a gardener who waters after the rain than from a short, dry period. When the fruits begin to ripen, especially in late July and August, some growers slightly reduce the water to concentrate the sugars and improve the flavor. I do this mainly with sauce tomatoes. The idea is not to brutally stress the plant, but to remain consistent with a little less water. Stable and slightly reduced, yes. Alternating between drought and excess water, no. The last piece of the puzzle is learning to observe the plant itself, because a tomato plant speaks to you constantly. It doesn't do it with words, of course, but with its leaves, its posture, its color, and the way it recovers after a hot day. A well-watered plant generally has firm leaves of a deep green that stand correctly in the morning. If in the middle or late afternoon, the leaves droop slightly during a very hot day, it is not necessarily a problem. Above 36 degrees, the tomato partially closes its stomata to limit water loss. It puts itself in economy mode. If it straightens up in the evening or the next morning, there is no need to panic. The real warning signal is morning wilting. If the leaves are limp at 7 or 8 a.m., even though the night was cooler and the soil should still contain moisture, the plant is clearly telling you it lacked water during the night. In this case, you must water deeply. Conversely, if the bottom leaves gradually turn yellow, especially when the soil stays wet several days in a row, you have probably gone too far. Too much water drives air out of the soil, fatigues the roots, and promotes diseases. Let it dry for 2 or 3 days before resuming. Leaves that curl up like small tubes can indicate thermal stress, but also irregular moisture. Before treating, fertilizing, or cutting anything, always check the soil. Now let's look at the 4 errors I find in almost every vegetable garden. The first is the small evening watering. We come home from work, take the hose, give each plant a little sip, and think we are doing well. In reality, this keeps the roots at the surface and creates the wet-dry alternation that weakens the fruit. The correction: water deeply 2 or 3 times a week, and then let the plant use its reserves. The second error is watering from above with a spray, a watering can rose, or an automatic sprinkler. The leaves stay wet, the fruits too, and fungal diseases find a perfect entry point. The correction: keep the water at soil level. If you must use a sprinkler, do it very early in the morning, but a drip or a soaker hose remains much better. The third error is the rigid calendar, Tuesday and Friday. Whether it rains or is dry, the plant doesn't read your agenda. It responds to the actual moisture of the soil. Use your calendar as a checkup reminder, not as a watering order. The fourth error is panicking after a dry period and suddenly drowning the plant. This shock is exactly what causes split fruits and calcium absorption problems. If you have fallen behind, water deeply but progressively. Return to the rhythm without excess. I made all these mistakes for years. They don't make you a bad gardener. They simply show that you were rarely explained how a tomato actually drinks. Now let's move on to the trick promised at the beginning. It is probably the one that changed my way of watering the most, especially during hot periods or when I'm short on time. It's called the buried bottle method. An old market gardener showed it to me a dozen years ago, and I've used it almost every season since. Take an empty plastic jug of about 4L, like an old milk, vinegar, or water jug. Pierce 6 to 8 small holes in the bottom third of the jug. The holes should be modest, about the size of a pencil tip. Next, bury the jug near the tomato plant, about 15 to 20 centimeters from the main stem. Leave only the neck protruding slightly above the ground. The cap should be removed or just placed on top without being tightened. When it comes time to water, you no longer pour water on the soil surface. You fill the jug, The water escapes slowly through the small holes over several hours and goes directly down to the deep root zone. This is exactly where the plant needs it. The advantage is huge. Almost no evaporation, no runoff, no wet leaves, and much less waste. You fill the jug in a few seconds and then let the system work on its own. For large indeterminate varieties like Brandywine or Cherokee Purple, I often use 2 jugs per plant. For determinate compact varieties or those grown in pots, 1 jug is usually enough. The first season I tried this method, my watering time was almost cut in half. I also saw fewer split tomatoes, very little blossom end rot, and more vigorous plants in August. Plus, it's a smart way to reuse a plastic container that would have ended up in the trash or recycling. It is often these simple, inexpensive, and well thought out tips that make a big difference at the end of the season. If this video helped you, tell me in the comments what problem you encounter most with your tomatoes. Split fruits, yellow leaves, blossom end rot, a plant that stagnates, or a lack of harvest. And share this video with a gardener who might be losing part of their production because of this simple watering error. If you only remember one thing today, let it be this. Water your tomatoes like the deep-rooted plants they truly are. Water slowly, deeply, mulch generously, observe your plants, and keep a stable rhythm. The harvest of over 40 kilos I told you about at the beginning was not a stroke of luck. It wasn't a magic variety. It was simply the right water at the right depth at the right time. I can't wait to hear how your plants react when you try it. If these secrets have changed the way you look at the life hidden beneath your garden soil, please subscribe and like the channel. We are digging up the wisdom that has been overlooked for too long. Plant the future with us. The next treasure of the garden will be revealed very soon.